In the 34 years Yun Ji-Hoon had been alive, no woman had ever dared to touch him without permission. Today, a girl with honey-brown skin and a terrified expression didn't just touch him, she branded his $5,000 shirt with a double-shot espresso. The air in the Onyx Paragon lobby freezes. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor as Raven Cole stares at the dark brown stain spreading across the chest of the most dangerous man in Los Angeles. Everyone expects him to ruin her life with a single word. Instead, Ji-Hoon does something he hasn't done in years. He looks. Really looks. The silence in the elevator was heavy enough to crush bone. Raven stared at her reflection in the polished gold doors, though she hardly recognized the woman looking back. Her braids were slightly frizzed from the humidity of the morning, and the massive, jagged coffee stain on her white silk blouse looked like a Rorschach test for unemployed. She had been at Onyx Paragon Group for exactly 3 weeks. She was the first in her family to graduate from Oxford, the girl who had clawed her way out of South London on a scholarship and a prayer. Now, she was likely the first trainee to be escorted to the 90th floor by 2 men who looked like they moonlighted as professional hitmen. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime that sounded like a funeral bell. The penthouse office was a minimalist's dream and a warm-blooded human's nightmare. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline, but the air inside was kept at a crisp, biting temperature. Behind a desk carved from a single slab of black obsidian sat Yun Ji-Hoon. He didn't look up. He was reading a file, his jaw set in a hard, angular line. He had changed his shirt, a fresh, crisp charcoal gray, but the memory of him standing in the lobby, looking down at his ruined suit with eyes like frozen daggers, made Raven's knees tremble. "Sit," he commanded. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the small of her back. Raven sat. She kept her back straight, clutching her tablet like a shield. "Mr. Yun, I want to formally apologize for the incident this morning. I am prepared to cover the cleaning costs, and I understand if my contract. I don't care about the suit, Miss Cole." He finally looked up. His eyes were dark, hooded, and unervingly focused. For the first time in her life, Raven felt completely seen, not as a diversity hire, not as a trainee, but as a person. It was terrifying. "Everyone in this building treats me like a god or a ghost," Ji-Hoon said, leaning forward. The light caught the sharp edge of his cheekbones. "They walk on eggshells. They hold their breath. But you? You were so busy looking at the data on your screen that you collided with the most dangerous man in the city." "It was an accident," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It was a disruption," he corrected. He stood up, walking around the desk with a predatory grace. He stopped just inches from her chair, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. "I've spent years building a world where nothing is out of place. And yet, I haven't been able to stop thinking about the mess you made." He leaned down, his face level with hers. "I'm not firing you, Raven. I'm moving your desk. You'll find your things are already in the anteroom. From today, you report only to me." The death sentence she expected had turned into something far more complicated, a cage made of glass, and a key held by a man who didn't believe in mercy. The anteroom wasn't a cubicle, it was a gilded cage. Raven stood in the center of the small, plush office connected directly to Ji-Hoon's suite, staring at her cardboard box of belongings. Her cheap, world's best in turn mug looked like a stray pebble in a cathedral of marble and chrome. She hadn't even had time to process the promotion before a silent, stone-faced security guard handed her a sleek, encrypted smartphone and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to be a novella. "You're late," a voice echoed from the doorway. Ji-Hoon stood there, leaning against the frame. He had discarded his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked more like those of a fighter than a financier. On his right wrist, the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo peeked out from under his cuff, a flash of ink that looked suspiciously like a dragon's tail. "I've been here for 10 minutes, Mr. Yun," Raven said, regaining her voice. "I was just organizing." "Don't organize. Anticipate," he said, stepping into her space. He dropped a heavy, leather-bound folder onto her desk. That is the portfolio for the Neo-Seoul redevelopment project. It's worth $4 billion. By tomorrow morning, I want a summary of every legal loophole our competitors might use to stall the demolition. Raven blinked. Sir, I'm a trainee. This is high-level legal analysis. Usually, the senior associates. The senior associates are terrified of me, Ji-Hoon interrupted, his eyes boring into hers. They tell me what they think I want to hear. I don't want a yes man, Miss Cole. I want the girl who was brave enough, or distracted enough, to ruin my favorite shirt. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. The air between them grew charged, a strange, electric tension that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. You're an outsider here. You see the cracks the others ignore. That is your value. Raven felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of ambition and pure, unadulterated fear. And what happens if I fail? Ji-Hoon's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in the depths of his gaze, a flicker of something that wasn't cold. It was hunger. In my world, failure isn't just a lost bonus, Raven. It's a liability. And I don't keep liabilities. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from her shoulder, as if he wanted to brush away a stray thread but caught himself at the last second. You're in the inner circle now, he whispered. The view is better from the top, but the wind is much colder. Try not to fall. He turned and vanished back into his office before she could respond, leaving her alone with the $4 billion folder and the realization that she hadn't just changed desks, she had entered a war zone. The clock on Raven's desk shifted to 11 p.m. The glass fortress of Onyx Paragon was silent, save for the hum of the HVAC and the frantic tapping of her keyboard. She was deep into the Neo-Seoul files, her eyes blurring over zoning laws and land deeds, when a muffled thud echoed from the other side of the connecting door. It wasn't the sound of a falling book. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Raven froze. Logic told her to stay put, but the instinct that had gotten her through the toughest streets of London pushed her upward. She pressed her hand against the heavy oak door and pushed. The scene inside Ji-Hoon's office had shifted from corporate to noir. The lights were dimmed to a low amber glow. Ji-Hoon wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the window, his back to her, but he wasn't alone. Two men in dark, nondescript suits stood before him, their heads bowed in a gesture that looked more like fear than respect. On the floor between them was a man Raven didn't recognize, bound, gagged, and trembling. I asked for the ledger, Minho, Ji-Hoon said. His voice was different now. The coldness was no longer a professional veneer, it was a weapon. It was the sound of a blade being drawn from a sheath. He says he burned it, boss, the taller man stammered. Ji-Hoon turned slightly, and Raven saw it, the light catching the silver of a brass knuckle tucked into his palm. No one burns what belongs to the Onyx family. They only hide it. Take him to the basement. Make sure he understands that my patience has a very short fuse. Raven's breath hitched. Her hand slipped on the doorframe, making a sharp click. The two henchmen reached for their waistbands in a blurred, synchronized motion. Stop, Ji-Hoon commanded. He didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the door, on Raven. The men relaxed, though their eyes remained predatory. Ji-Hoon signaled with a flick of his wrist. Get him out of here. Now. They dragged the prisoner away through a side exit Raven hadn't known existed. Silence reclaimed the room, but it was a different kind of quiet, bloody and thick. Ji-Hoon didn't move. He stood in the center of his empire, his chest rising and falling slowly. You should have left an hour ago, Raven, he said, finally turning to face her. Raven stepped into the room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Who was that? What is this place, really? Ji-Hoon walked toward her, wiping a smear of something dark from his knuckle with a silk handkerchief. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to his icy reputation. I told you this was a fortress, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I just didn't tell you what I was guarding it against. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, making her shiver despite the heat. Now you've seen the crack in the glass. You can run, or you can help me seal it. Choose carefully. The tension of the previous night hung between them like a physical weight, but Raven didn't run. Instead, she showed up at 7 a.m. with 2 brown paper bags that smelled of spices, grease, and home, a stark defiance of the sterile, scentless atmosphere of the 90th floor. Ji-Hoon was already at his desk, looking as though he hadn't slept, though his suit was, as always, flawless. He looked at the bags, then at her. What is that? I have a tasting scheduled with a Michelin-starred chef for the gala menu. Forget the chef, Raven said, her voice bolder than it had been 24 hours ago. She set a container of jerk chicken, mac and cheese, and fried plantains directly onto his obsidian desk. You said I'm here because I'm an outsider. Well, this is my world. And you look like you need a reminder that life exists outside of glass walls and private basements. Ji-Hoon stared at the food as if it were a complex mathematical equation. He picked up a fork with the same precision he used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. He took a bite of the chicken. The silence lasted a heartbeat too long. Then, his shoulders, usually pulled tight as a bowstring, dropped a fraction of an inch. A small, genuine sound escaped his throat, a huff of surprise. It's loud, he remarked, the heat of the Scotch bonnet peppers finally hitting him. A faint flush crept up his neck. It's called flavor, Ji-Hoon, Raven teased, the use of his first name slipping out before she could stop it. He didn't correct her. Instead, he leaned back, watching her with a gaze that was no longer predatory, but intensely curious. In my family, meals were a performance of power. Who sat where, who spoke first. Everything was cold before it even reached the table. Well, in South London, if the food is cold, someone's getting yelled at, she laughed. For a moment, the CEO and the trainee vanished. There was just a man and a woman sharing a meal in a tower of gold. But the moment was broken by a vibration on Ji-Hoon's phone. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar frost. The board is asking about the security breach from last night, he said, his voice hardening. He looked at Raven, his gaze lingering on her lips before moving back to her eyes. You brought me into your world for 20 minutes, Raven. But don't forget, tonight, you have to survive mine. He pushed the food away, the cold king, returning to his throne, but as Raven cleared the desk, she noticed he had finished every last bite. The first crack in his armor hadn't been made by a weapon. It had been made by a girl with a paper bag and a story. The luxury sedan was a silent bubble of leather and shadows as it cut through the neon-soaked streets of Los Angeles. Ji-Hoon sat in the corner of the back seat, his face illuminated intermittently by the passing streetlights. He looked like a statue carved from moonlight. Tonight is a formality, Ji-Hoon said, his voice cutting through the hum of the tires. But in my world, formalities are where the most blood is spilled. Stay within 3 feet of me. Do not take a drink from anyone but the waiter I point out. And if I tell you to move, you don't ask why, you run. Raven smoothed the skirt of her dress, a deep emerald silk that Ji-Hoon had sent to her apartment that afternoon. It felt like armor. Who is the threat tonight? The Park Syndicate, he replied, his jaw tightening. They think my interest in you is a crack in the glass. They think I've grown soft because I haven't fired the girl who spilled coffee on me. The car pulled up to a private estate in the hills. As the door opened, the sound of a string quartet clashed with the heavy presence of armed men stationed like gargoyles along the perimeter. Inside, the gala was a sea of black ties and silk. Ji-Hoon moved through the crowd with Raven on his arm, his grip on her elbow firm and grounding. To the public, they were the powerful CEO and his rising star trainee. To the eyes watching from the corners, they were a target and his shield. Mr. Yun, a gravelly voice called out. A man with silver hair and a jagged scar running through his eyebrow approached. This was Park Sang-ho. His eyes didn't go to Ji-Hoon, they raked over Raven with a sickening, proprietary hunger. So, this is the little disruption I've heard so much about. She's far more, vibrant than your usual acquisitions. Raven felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Ji-Hoon's hand shifted from her elbow to the small of her back, his fingers splaying out in a possessive, protective gesture. She is not an acquisition, Park, Ji-Hoon said, his voice dropping to a register that made the glasses on a nearby tray vibrate. She is an employee of Onyx Paragon. Which means she is under my personal protection. Park chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Protection is a heavy burden, Ji-Hoon. It would be a shame if something unscripted happened to such a delicate thing. As Park walked away, Ji-Hoon leaned down, his lips brushing Raven's ear. His breath was warm, but his words were ice. He's signaling the hit. We leave in 5 minutes. Do not let go of my hand. In that moment, Raven realized that shadow wasn't just a metaphor. It was a physical presence, a darkness that was currently closing in on them both. The gala wasn't a party, it was an ambush. The escape was a blur of screeching tires and shattered crystal. Park's men had moved faster than anticipated, intercepting them in the darkened garden of the estate. Ji-Hoon had reacted with a terrifying, surgical violence, pulling a hidden firearm and ushering Raven into the armored SUV just as the first rounds whistled through the air. Now, inside the safe house, a stark, concrete and glass loft hidden in the arts district, the adrenaline was crashing. Raven sat on the edge of a leather sofa, her hands shaking so violently she had to tuck them under her thighs. The emerald silk of her dress was torn at the shoulder, a stark reminder of how Ji-Hoon had tackled her to the ground when the glass began to fly. Ji-Hoon stood by a steel counter, his back to her. He had stripped off his dress shirt, it lay discarded on the floor, soaked in a mixture of rain and red. You're bleeding, Raven whispered, her voice cracking. It's a graze, he snapped, though he winced as he tried to reach a jagged cut along his ribs. The dragon tattoo on his back seemed to writhe as his muscles flexed. Raven stood up, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a stubborn sense of duty. Sit down, Ji-Hoon. You can't reach that. He turned, eyes flashing with a spark of his usual icy defiance, but when he saw the look in her eyes, the raw, shaking courage, his shoulders slumped. He sat. Raven found a first aid kit in the kitchen. Her fingers were cold as she pressed a sterile wipe against his side. Ji-Hoon hissed, his hand flying out to catch her wrist. His grip was tight, his pulse thundering against her skin. For a long moment, they stayed like that, connected by a thin line of pain and a heartbeat. I shouldn't have brought you, he rasped, his gaze fixed on her face. I thought I could control the chaos. I thought I could keep you in the light while I stayed in the dark. I'm not made of glass, Ji-Hoon, Raven said, her voice growing steadier. She pulled her wrist free and continued cleaning the wound. You don't get to decide what I can handle. She looked up, and the distance between them evaporated. The cold king was gone, replaced by a man who looked utterly haunted. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, a gesture so tender it hurt more than the violence of the night. You are the only thing in my life that isn't a calculation, he whispered. He leaned in, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't the polished, professional world of Onyx Paragon. It was salt, iron, and desperation. It was a collision of two worlds that should never have touched, breaking the last of the glass between them. The morning light in the safe house was unforgiving, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows with a sharpness that matched the ache in Raven's chest. Ji-Hoon was gone from the room, leaving only the scent of sandalwood on the sheets and a stack of encrypted tablets on the counter. Raven's mind was a whirlwind of the previous night's heat, but the analyst in her couldn't stop working. She picked up one of the tablets, a device Ji-Hoon had used to track the Park Syndicate's finances. Her fingers moved instinctively, navigating through the layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Then, she saw a name that stopped her heart, C&M Holdings. It was the defunct investment firm that had liquidated her father's small logistics business 10 years ago in London, plunging her family into a cycle of debt and desperation that had nearly broken them. She dug deeper, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The signatures on the acquisition papers were digital, but the parent company was unmistakable. Onyx Paragon Group. You're awake. Ji-Hoon stood in the doorway, freshly dressed in a black turtleneck, looking every bit the untouchable king again. He noticed the tablet in her hand, and the stillness that came over him was more telling than a confession. CNM Holdings, Raven said, her voice trembling with a different kind of fire than the night before. They targeted minority-owned businesses in South London for aggressive liquidations. They destroyed my father. They're the reason I had to fight for every scrap of my education. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears of betrayal. You didn't hire me because I spilled coffee on you, did you? You hired me because you knew exactly who I was. Is this your version of a guilt payment? Ji-Hoon didn't move. The silence stretched, cold and suffocating. I didn't know until the second week, he said, his voice flat. The acquisition was handled by my father's branch of the syndicate. By the time I found the connection, you were already in the building. And you didn't tell me? Raven stepped toward him, the tablet clattering onto the steel table. You let me fall for you while you were sitting on the throne of the empire that ruined my family? I was trying to fix it, Ji-Hoon said, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. I was trying to move the money back into your family's accounts without raising suspicion from the board. I don't want your blood money. Raven snapped. The intimacy of the night before felt like a lie, a beautiful mask over a hideous truth. I thought you were different from them. But you're just the same, using people like pieces on a board. Raven, listen to me. No, she whispered, backing away. I was a fool to think a man who lives in the shadows could ever handle the light. She grabbed her coat and her pride, leaving the cold king alone in his concrete fortress, the glass between them finally shattered beyond repair. The rain in Los Angeles didn't wash things clean, it only turned the grid into a slick, dangerous sludge. Raven hadn't slept in 48 hours. She was huddled in a small motel in East LA, her eyes burning as she stared at her laptop. She had intended to run, but the data she'd pulled from Ji-Hoon's tablet revealed a truth she couldn't ignore. The Park Syndicate wasn't just targeting Ji-Hoon. They were using the CNM Holdings records to frame him for the very crimes his father had committed, intending to trigger a cleansing that would end in his execution. Suddenly, her phone shrieked, an emergency bypass alert she'd programmed into the Onyx mainframe. System breach. Level 90. Manual override initiated. No, she whispered. Park wasn't waiting for a legal frame-up. He was taking the fortress by force. Raven didn't think. She drove. By the time she reached the downtown glass tower, the lobby was a graveyard of shattered marble and smoke. The elevators were dead, but Raven knew the skeletal structure of this building better than the men currently storming it. She slipped through the service entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached the 90th floor via the pressurized fire stairwell, her lungs screaming. The air smelled of ozone and cordite. The penthouse was a war zone. Ji-Hoon was pinned behind the black obsidian desk, his forearm bleeding, his eyes narrowed as he traded fire with 3 of Park's men near the elevator bank. He was being flanked. The security systems he relied on had been turned against him, the automated shutters were locking him in a kill box. Raven dove for the auxiliary terminal tucked under the reception desk. Her fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the encrypted locks she'd spent weeks studying. Raven? Get out of here. Ji-Hoon roared over the gunfire, his voice cracking with a terror she had never heard before. Shut up and duck, she screamed back. With a final keystroke, she executed a blackout protocol. The floor plunged into absolute darkness. The heavy internal fire doors slammed shut, bisecting the room and trapping 2 of the gunmen in the hallway. Raven felt a hand grab her waist in the dark, pulling her behind a reinforced pillar just as a spray of bullets riddled the reception desk. You came back, Ji-Hoon breathed into her hair. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer force of his grip on her. I'm still mad at you, Raven hissed, her adrenaline reaching a fever pitch. But no one gets to take you down but me. Now, the vents in the anteroom lead to the helipad. If I loop the security cameras, we have exactly 60 seconds. In the chaos, the trainee and the CEO were gone. There were only two survivors, held together by a fraying thread of trust and the cold, hard reality that they were the only ones who could save each other. The dawn that broke over Los Angeles was different. The air was scrubbed clean by the storm, and the sun hit the charred remains of the 90th floor with a blinding, unforgiving light. The siege was over. Park was in federal custody, his empire dismantled by the very digital trail Raven had unspooled during the height of the firefight. Ji-Hoon stood on the edge of the helipad, the wind whipping his dark hair. He wasn't wearing a suit. For the first time, he wore a simple black shirt, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the dragon tattoo in its entirety. It wasn't a symbol of the syndicate, it was a mark of what he had survived. Raven walked toward him, her movements slow. Her emerald dress was ruined beyond repair, stained with soot and the ghosts of a life she was no longer sure she wanted. She stopped a few feet away, looking out at the city that suddenly felt much smaller than it had 3 weeks ago. "The board is gone," Ji-Hoon said, his voice stripped of its usual icy authority. He didn't turn around. "I've liquidated the assets tied to the old ways. The shadow side of Onyx Paragon is being cauterized. It will take years to rebuild as a legitimate entity." "And your father?" Raven asked. "Exiled," Ji-Hoon replied, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were no longer frozen glass, they were tired, human, and devastatingly honest. "I used the evidence you found to ensure he never touches a cent of this company's money again. The restitution to the families in South London, including yours, has already been processed." Raven let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she first stepped into the lobby. "You didn't have to do that to prove yourself to me." "I didn't do it for you," he said, stepping closer. "I did it because I couldn't look at you and be that man anymore. You didn't just spill coffee on me, Raven. You spilled light into a room I had kept dark for 34 years. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, an unspoken question. "I'm stepping down as CEO. I need to lead this transition from the ground, not from a throne. And I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm becoming a monster again." Raven looked at his hand, then up into the dark depths of his eyes. The power dynamic had shifted. She wasn't the trainee anymore, and he wasn't the king. They were just two people standing on the ruins of a fortress, looking at a horizon that was finally clear. "I'm still not a yes man," she warned, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. Ji-Hoon's eyes softened, a flash of the man she'd seen over a paper bag of jerk chicken. "I'm counting on it." Raven reached out and took his hand, her fingers locking with his. The glass fortress had fallen, but as they walked toward the stairs together, it felt like they were finally standing on solid ground.